Hello everybody, good evening, welcome once again. It's the last Wednesday of the month, so that means it's time for the next Barts Heritage webinar. My name is Robert Chahan-Jones, I'm the chairman of the Friends of Barts Heritage. I'd like to offer a particularly warm welcome to all those organisations with whom we at Barts Heritage have a reciprocal publicity arrangement. So I'm thinking in particular of the City Music Foundation, who've been hosting a number of free concerts on a monthly basis in the Great Hall, also the Friends of the Charterhouse, and also, of course, the Barts League of Nurses. So whether you are new to the Barts Heritage webinar series or old friends, welcome to you all. As you will know, these webinars are free of charge. You have the option to give us a donation, and they would be very welcome indeed. And thanks to many of you who've already donated. You can do so by simply going to the Barts Heritage website, that's bartsheritage.org.uk, and the big yellow donate button is quite clear there to see, and you can, if you wish, add in the option of gift aid on top of your donation during the donation process. Also thanks to those increasing numbers who wish to raise their support for Barts Heritage to a higher level by becoming members of our patron circle. So welcome to you as well. Now, news, I've mentioned the website already. Very shortly, hopefully even tomorrow, fingers crossed, we will be launching our new website. It's featuring some fantastic photography, specially commissioned for the process. So we'll be very interested to hear what you make of it. Do let us know what you think of that new website. And also click on the Get Involved button that's in the top menu bar quite clearly. And it gives you a whole number of ways in which you can become more involved in the Barts Heritage project. As well as the donation, there's the opportunity for volunteering for many aspects of what will happen over the next several years. Finally, without further ado, let us move on to the subject matter of this evening. As you will know, if you're familiar with the format, my guest and I will have a chat and the presentation for some 40-45 minutes. Do make use during the presentation of the Q&A button or the chat button that's at the bottom of your screen. If you hover your mouse, those buttons come up. We might use the opportunity to bring in some of your questions to our guest during the evening, and we hope to handle any questions that are outstanding at the end of the session. So without further ado, let me introduce my guest, Dr. David Wilkinson. Welcome to you, David.
Thank you very much, Robert. Good to be here.
Now, of course, you and I go back really quite some years to the last century because we were both medical students together at Barts. We overlapped by a year or two, I seem to remember. Now, a lot of people have seen the publicity words for tonight and are already beginning to ask the question, David, you were the self-professed terrible medical student. Now, do tell us a little bit more about that and how exactly you define that, can you?
Well, yes, okay. Well, I came to Barts in 1966, in the middle of the swinging 60s, really. And so there seemed to be an awful lot to do apart from medicine. And I failed second MB and had to retake that. I failed, I then sort of moved into the clinical side of things, apparently. I hadn't really realized you had to go along to things for quite a while. I remember going to one series of things and a chap came up to me and said, "Oh, you're Wilkinson, are you?" And I said, "Yes." "Oh, we've been looking for you for 3 months," they said. So I failed the whole of conjoint twice. I failed MB, BS, the whole of that as well. And then eventually I qualified on conjoint and caught up with everybody and then took MB the following April while I was doing house jobs. So I think that's why I said I wasn't a very good student.
Well, if it's any consolation, I think I can share your experience on a number of those fronts, but let's not go into that. We could spend a whole evening, couldn't we, discussing on the value to be gained from your years at medical school? Is it primarily
Absolutely.
academic or social or sporting or whatever? And what skills and new knowledge do you hope to bring out at the end of it? And will it make you a better doctor? So let's not go down that road. Let's move right along, because thankfully your career in anesthetics went from strength to strength. Tell us a little bit about how you achieved your position as a consultant at Barts and head of department, and then of course developed this whole interest in the history of anesthesia itself.
Right. Well, I started my anaesthetic career at Whipps Cross, which is now part of the Barts conglomerate. And I'd started by doing obstetrics. I was going to be an obstetrician, and then I moved into anesthesia, and I failed, of course, my primary several times, 3 times. I failed my primary, got it on the 4th attempt. And I was at Whipps, you had an opportunity to move up to registrar status, even though you'd failed primary so many times. And one of the outside examiners was Dick Ellis, who was a consultant at Barts, and he came to me afterwards and said, well done for moving up to registrar. And when you got that primary thing, he said, you want to think about coming to Barts? So I then applied to Barts after I got my primary and got my final first time, and then went away to Australia for a year, to Western Australia, and then came back. I'd been appointed a consultant just before I went away to Australia and came back. I'm not sure whether it was to their relief or disappointment, but I did turn up. And from there, I went from strength to strength. I did a lot of research with medical electronics, which was very exciting. I built a day surgery unit, which became the sort of blueprint for the NHS to use. And it was very, very sort of great time there.
Excellent. Okay. Well, without further ado, let's get stuck straight in, because I know you've got a lot to share with us this evening, particularly some interesting theories about the origin of anesthesia itself. So away you go, David.
Right. Thank you very much. Barts, as you know, was founded in 1123. And when Reher founded the hospital, he also started the Augustine Priory, dedicated to the Holy Cross and St. Bartholomew. And he was appointed the first prior of that priory. And there he is in all his glory in Barts the Great. And if you look at Barts the Great, I think you can just imagine how great that priory must have been. And that's just a small sort of fragment of the huge priory that existed on that site. With all those Augustinian monks, and it must have been an absolutely wonderful building. And Barts, of course, was situated outside the city of London, in countryside, really. Although it was in countryside, there were various rules that the master of the hospital had to have. And these are the sort of rules you'd like to see nowadays, really, in your average physician. And he didn't have to be a physician, he just was a monk with these basic rules, and waiting on the sick with diligence and care in all gentleness, and celebrating Mass daily for the sick, either by himself or some other person, should they in any wise be unable to come into the chapel to celebrate. So here's an early map showing an idea of where the priory was, surrounded by fields and gardens and outside the city of London, as I was saying. So a huge establishment with all this ground around it. And you can see that they would have been growing vegetables for the monks and for the hospital patients. But they also had very large herbariums, and they used these herbs in their work, on the day-to-day work. Now, opium, as most people will know, contains all sorts of analgesics: heroin, morphine, codeine. It's a mixture. And it's been cited many times in Arab medical texts, all sorts of claims that it was used by an anesthetic, by Albucasis and Avicenna, but the evidence for that remains rather opaque to my mind. And I think it's going to improve because more and more of these ancient texts are being translated nowadays, and we're getting more and more of view into the Arabic and Indian medicines, which are, to my mind, so fascinating from this time. But let's move to China. Let's have a look at this great man, Hua Tuo, who was born in 140 in Bozhu in the Anhui province of China, which is now one of the centers of Chinese traditional medicine. A beautiful place. That's his statue on the bottom left there, and that's just the sort of site you see in the dam itself. He became a very adept at acupuncture and moxibustion, which is the burning of herbs on the end of the acupuncture needle, and created one of the first anesthetic mixtures of all time, as far as we're aware, from herbal sources. He called this Marfei San, which can be translated as cannabis boiling powder, and he dissolved it in wine. But the exact recipe of how he did it and what he did have been lost together with all his other writings. But I think it's also interesting that he developed Tai Chi, which he called the exercise of the 5 animals, which was the movement of the bear, the crane, the tiger, the monkey, and the deer, which is so popular in modern culture. He was executed in 208 by the local warlord Cao Cao, who asked him to come and have a look at him because he wasn't feeling very well. But Hua Tuo decided not to do that and went home to see his wife instead. So the local warlord executed him. And we lost the constituents of Marfei San as all his works were burnt. So herbal mixtures have been created to produce an anesthetic state on and off for the next 16 centuries. And these concoctions were of very doubtful efficacy and have defied modern reproducibility. They had a very close lethal dose to therapeutic dose, so the margin of safety was pretty poor. And they were always created by monastic orders. And one of the most popular plants to form a basis for some of these herbal mixtures was Mandrake. And Mandrake contains some very powerful alkaloids. It contains scopolamine, and it was described by Dioscorides to produce an unconscious state position. And here's the classic root of the plant, which is said to be rather like a human form. And this caused quite a lot of problems. As Dioscorides said, using a cyanthus of it on those who cannot sleep or are grievously pained or being cut or cauterized, they will not feel pain. And a cyanthus was a long-haired Greek silver spoon, such as we see at the bottom. And I'm sure everybody listening to this has got one in their cutlery drawer at the moment. So the mandrake is really a tremendous plant to go and collect. It grows, as you all are aware, best underneath a gallows tree, and it contains an evil spirit in the roots. But when you pull the plant up, the plant gives a terrible shriek, and anything that hears it is immediately falls dead. So your method of collection was to tie a trusty dog to the plant, put a bowl of food a little further over. The dog rushes towards the food, uproots the plant gives a terrible shriek, and the dog sadly falls dead. Now you don't fall dead because at the moment of the plant is being uprooted, you blow on your trumpet that you're carrying with you, and you immediately rush up and behead the evil spirit living in the roots with your silver sword. So it's quite a complex collection to go through if you want to give your anesthetic. And I think we find nowadays it's a little bit easier. One of the other plants that was very effective, apparently, in producing sleep was lettuce. Beatrix Potter was a very competent not a physician, but a pharmacologist. And in the tale of the Flopsy bunnies, which you probably recollect, all the bunnies came in and ate too much of Mr. McGregor's lettuces and were caught when they all fell asleep. And so lettuce is a very powerful way of putting people off to sleep. And it contains a phytonutrient called lactocurium, which is said to relieve pain and promote relaxation. It can be made into a tea and drunk. I've never actually seen any lettuce tea, but perhaps some of those that are listening in have done so.
Could I ask you, David,
Yeah.
on the lettuce theory, there was a vogue for those who were trying to avoid the habitual nature of tobacco a while back. There was a vogue for lettuce cigarettes.
Oh, really?
You're not familiar with those, obviously.
I'm not, no. Okay. I mean, all sorts of things have been put in cigarettes, as you well know, to promote various states of mind. So, anyway, let's have a look at hemlock, which is known as the devil's flower, and that contains two very powerful alkaloids. The last one, quinine, has the ability to stop you breathing after an initial sense of anesthesia. And Socrates was said to have used hemlock tea to hasten his own death. And so I want you to remember these plants. We've got mandrake, we've got lettuce, we've got hemlock, and we've got henbane as well, stinking nightshade. And henbane contains hyoscyamine, atropine, and scopolamine, all of which are very powerful alkaloids. Now, throughout the Middle Ages, and well, before and after the Middle Ages, there were these concept of the soporific sponge, which was a mixture of opium, mandrake, hemlock, and henbane in water, soaked into a sponge, dried in the sun, and then soaked in hot water when you wanted to use it again. And it was applied damp to the nose and mouth. And this was said to put people off to sleep, and it worked very well. But everybody who's tried to reproduce this according to those recipes has failed to find a combination that works. And one of the best set of recipes for these soporific sponges can be found in the Monte Cassino Abbey. Of course, Monte Cassino is probably most notorious during the conflict in the Second World War. But look at this. This is a fabulous parchment from the Cambridge libraries. And in that, we find to make a drink that men call dwell, to make a man sleep while he can be carved. Oh, it's just fantastic. And if you look down this recipe, you can see there's the hemlock, bit of lettuce, strange stuff called pape, henbane again. Put in a glass bottle, in a glass vessel, add some good wine, mix it together, and when it is needed, let him that shall be carved sit against a good fire, and make him to drink thereof till he fall asleep, and then may right you safely carve him. And when you have done the cure and would have him to awaken, take vinegar and salt, and wash well his temples and his cheekbones, and he shall awake from rest. Isn't that a great description of sending somebody off to sleep for an anesthetic? And if you look at those ingredients, then bile, which was part of it, was used to aid absorption, I think. Hemlock we've talked about. Neep is bryony, which is a root and probably a mandrake substitute. Lettuce we've mentioned. Pape is opium. Henbane we've talked about. Esyl is vinegar used to waken the patient up, and alcohol is the carrier. So this dwell was a really phenomenal combination of things to produce anesthesia in the Middle Ages. And you think, well, it's all just a story and it can't really be true, and nobody can reproduce it. Well, what about this? Sutra Isle is a medieval hospital run again by the Augustine order on the main road between England and Scotland. It was founded in 1164, just after Barts, and survived until the mid-1650s. There's not a lot to see there now, but there on Deer Street is where it was. And they've got this SHARP project, which is the Supra Hospital Archaeo-Ethnopharmacological Research Project. And they've got over 200 researchers working on this. They dug all sorts of trenches, and they found huge amounts of seeds, and aggregates of seeds, blood, and cut pieces of bone. And the seed combinations of henbane, hemlock, and opium are in proportions similar to the dwell-like recipes that I've already referred to. And so there it is, and none of those plants can be found in that area naturally. They were all brought in. So here we have the monks producing powerful anesthetic combinations. And so after I'm going to come back to this at the end, but Henry VIII really destroyed all that when he caused the dissolution of the monasteries. And we lost all this lore about analgesia and herbal remedies. That was until the great Sesshu Hanaoka came on the scene. And Sesshu Hanaoka was a Japanese surgeon of the Edo period. And he tried to review the work of Huatou. Well, he couldn't find anything written, but there were all the stories coming through about what Huatou had done. And he spent some 30 years creating his own oral anesthesia, which he called Marfutsuzen. And this was an incredible amount of work. And it was made up of a variety of herbs, all again containing powerful alkaloids. And here are the 6 constituents of this Marfutsuzen. Datura, which is found all over the world in various herbal things, is a really toxic, dangerous, poisonous plant. Aconita, Angelica dahura, Angelica situloba, Cnidium, and Aricema. And he originally made the combination of drugs dissolved in sake, and then later developed a water-based formula which worked extremely well. So by May of 1796, he'd created an anesthetic state in at least 10 volunteers. And his main volunteers were his wife and his mother-in-law. Now, the main side effects of these very potent alkaloids was to cause the pupils to dilate. And often they stayed dilated for a very long time. I'm talking about weeks and months. And in fact, his mother-in-law went blind because of this constant passage of these drugs into her system. But he kept on refining the system, and on October the 13th, 1804, he performed a general anesthetic for the removal of a breast lump, which is without doubt a full general anesthetic, fully documented and fully reported. So we've actually got the anesthetic chart in Japan and all the details about it. Quite an incredible piece of work. And he trained many people in his school of surgery, and they spread that practice throughout the whole of Japan. And there are movies about this. A great man, and stamps have been issued about him. But he's not that well known in modern circles, except in Japan. And of course, Japan at that time was an isolated country. There was a small Portuguese and Dutch input going in. And so, although anesthesia came in 1846 in the way of ether and chloroform the following year, it didn't come into Japan until much later on. And so they continued to use Sesshu Hanaoka's method of anesthesia in Japan across the whole country for some 50 years. And then as the Western influence moved into Japan, so chloroform was introduced and ether as well. And that was much easier to prepare and use than Hanaoka's complex drugs. And so it disappeared. Now, did it really work? a very good friend of mine who's a professor of anesthesia in Japan created the exact recipe from Hanoka's papers. He got a volunteer in his department to drink an amount of the fluid, and within 20 minutes, she was deeply unconscious. She was admitted to the intensive care unit. She had gastric lavage. She was intensely observed, and she had a fairly uneventful recovery after 24 hours, but her pupils remained dilated for another week. So yes, this definitely works as an anesthetic, but again, the balance between therapy and safety are slightly obscure.
I've got to ask, did she sign a consent form before this took place?
I think the ethics of that experimental work is slightly dubious, to put it mildly. So I think we can say really that most effective analgesics were based on herbal lore, and early civilizations may have had alternatives which appeared completely incomprehensible in modern translations. Who did what and when they did it and what exactly they did is now very difficult to determine with absolute accuracy. I've had some quite interesting talks with botanists who tell me that if I grow my plant in my garden here in North Wales, and I pull it up and extract something from it, and Robert grows exactly the same plant in his soil around the London area, and he takes it out and extracts it, it'll contain different amounts of things because of the soil and the whole nature of the botany. So to define exactly how all these things work becomes more and more difficult. I would like to suggest to you all watching this program that this might well be the anesthetic drug cupboard of the past, these herbariums found around monasteries and in Chelsea Herb Garden and various other places. These were the original anesthetic drug cupboards. Henry VIII, when he destroyed the monasteries and their libraries, resulted in the loss of all that knowledge within a few generations. The monks spent their whole lifetime, some of them transcribing these books, and that was all lost. The apothecaries were still around, but after a few generations, no one was asking for these combinations anymore. It disappeared from general practice. And we had to wait for another 200 years for a new method of analgesia and anesthesia to evolve. I'd like to suggest that the idea that anesthesia began on the 16th of October 1846, when William Morton gave ether to Gilbert Abbott in the Massachusetts General Hospital, is just not true. The idea that in the Middle Ages and elsewhere, nobody had any analgesia is just not true in my mind. I think these were the illustrious anesthetic predecessors of our profession. And I think it's quite a reasonable hypothesis to go on. So thank you all very much indeed. I'm happy to take some questions, or you can contact me now later on my email address. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Well, let's just cast our eye down the list of questions. We'll start off with, who should we start off with? James Gilchrist, I think, one of our contemporaries again. And he says, is closed circuit halothane using a Maxwell House coffee jar as the reservoir still taught as a valuable anesthetic technique to medical students?
Yeah. I mean, I know exactly who used to do that, and it was a very effective technique. So, yeah, that works very well.
This wouldn't be one of George Ellis's tricks, would it, David?
No, that was Tom Bolton who used to do that. Tom was the great one for finding ways of getting anesthetics in difficult circumstances. And he published profusely on this, but his Maxwell House jar was very popular.
Now, Fiona Schneider, who was herself a Barts medical student, and she tells us that when you were a consultant anaesthetist, you gave her the GA to have her wisdom teeth out. But more pertinently, as far as your talk is concerned, she asks, could you recommend lettuce for sleepless menopausal women?
Well, I suppose, there's nothing, it wouldn't do any harm. I'm not sure, which lettuce. You're going to have to try every lettuce on the Sainsbury's cupboards or on the shelves there. I don't know which particular lettuce would be the effective one, but why not? Okay. It's a lot better than all those tablets, for sure.
Well, Iris Redbourne has written in to say she has some experience of lettuce because she has some wild lettuce tea, but it doesn't in fact put her to sleep. So presumably she gets the whatever other effect that she wants from a cup of tea without the without the sleep induction.
Without the soporific, or maybe she's just inured to it because she drinks so much of it.
Maybe you're right. Now, our contemporaries are coming up the woodwork here because Kevin Gunning, who was in the same year as me back in the last century and went on to become a consultant anaesthetist at Addenbrooke's, he asks, will any of this be, or is it already available in a written form? So this is your chance to, I suppose, to promote your proposed book.
Well, yeah, that's very kind of you, Robert. I am trying to write a history of the Department of Anesthesia and at Barts. And I'm taking it from 1123 to 2000. And I'm doing that because, as I really believe, in the 12th century, anesthesia was being produced. So I hope it'll all be in that. But I haven't published this anywhere else yet.
Okay, well, as and when the time comes, we promise to do our bit in making the news of it available to the wider world. William Dyer asks, now here's an interesting one because he says there's evidence of trepanning of the skull from over 2,000 years ago, and surely the patient would have been knocked out for that procedure with herbal medicine. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting concept. There are huge numbers of Neolithic skulls which show very effective trepanning, and it shows bone regrowth into the areas where the hull was done. So they certainly survived it. It was thought to be done for severe head injuries, so they might have been unconscious anyway when they started. It was also done for major fractures, they believe, and also for, just ordinary headaches and things. Now, whether they gave any other analgesia for that, I don't know. When the only painful part of that procedure is when you go through the skin. There are no pain receptors in bone, so you can drill through the skull without any further anesthesia at all.
Thanks for that. Please, everybody, don't go and attempt this on your wife, as David has already recommended. And yet, as we know full well, medical men of yesteryear seemed to choose their wives as their first volunteers, didn't they, for a whole variety of techniques. And indeed, Alessandro Conti, one of our viewers, comes on to say that many techniques that you've described tonight do seem to be dangerous by today's standards. So are there any of those you've already mentioned which could be used today with little or no modification?
No. I think is the answer. I think in this day and age, we need to have very accurate idea of what we're giving and what's in it, and to titrate it in properly. The modern anesthesia is incredibly safe, as I hope everybody listening to this knows. And these practices are hideously unsafe, but I'm just putting them there as an option that something was going on. It wasn't just a blank space.
Simon Phillips makes two comments. First, he says that Socrates was sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. And he also mentions there is or was a soporific sponge and apparatus in the Museum for Medical Medicine in Damascus.
Right.
Do you happen to know whether that museum still exists, bearing in mind the conflict in that country for the last many years?
Yeah, it's shocking, isn't it? I suspect it's gone. The damage in Damascus is absolutely catastrophic at the moment, and you know, the World Federation of Societies of Anesthesiologists had Syria as one of its main components. The society's just gone. The majority of anesthetists have been forced to flee, and we have very little access into what's going on there.
Thank you. Well, the questions coming in thick and fast. James Foster, another of our contemporaries, says that his father has, hang on a minute now, it just flicked out of view. His father has a cine film of a trephine being done on the Maasai in Kenya.
Wow.
So that must be an interesting thing to watch. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll have to find out about that from Jim. Thank you.
Now, Fiona Schneider has come back following your comments on lettuce to say that she's a retired gynecologist. I think she worked in Nottingham, if my memory serves correctly. And she recommended 1 tablet of St. John's wort to stop waking in the night for the menopausal ladies. But presumably that was the antidepressive action, although it seemed to work well. So she's saying, thank you for your thoughts on lettuce. I'll see how that goes down.
Very good. I mean, St. John's wort was very, very effective, wasn't it? So another one of these very, very potent herbal remedies.
But it interacts with quite a lot of other prescribable medicine. I know in my specialist area that it's one of those things that you need to watch out for, because it's one of those natural remedies that people tend not to mention when you ask them what other medication they're on. And because it interacts with a whole number of things, sometimes it's necessary to ask specifically whether they're taking that. Now, I'm just casting my eye down the list of, just to see if we have, I think, in fact, if there are no more questions. Thank you, David. That was absolutely fascinating. And I certainly look forward to seeing more of your ideas set down in a more formal way, and eventually that book. I do hope you have the time and the inclination to do that, and that you find a publisher, or maybe we could, with our contacts here at Barts Heritage, we could help in some way.
Well, I shall hold you to that.
Thank you to everybody for watching this evening. I hope you enjoyed it. I know that you enjoy watching these free webinars that we've been putting on for some 8 or 9 months now, because you write and tell us. So do keep those emails coming in. It gladdens our hearts to be able to read them and to know that we are putting on speakers and topics that interest you, not purely around Barts and its heritage, but wider aspects of other organizations around the Smithfield area as well. Many of you have been asking what is going to happen as restrictions ease. Are we still going to run these events? Well, the answer is yes, we very much hope to, but we might do that in a hybrid format that some of you will be familiar with, whereby we run a live event in the Great Hall, in the traditional sense, where people can come along, meet each other, enjoy a glass of wine and hear the speaker. But others of you who may be able to join virtually, simply because you can't come to London. And so we hope to meet the needs of both audiences, because tonight we've had several hundred people watching, far more than we could reasonably fit into the Great Hall for one of our standard events. Looking further ahead to View Day, the second Wednesday in May is always View Day. Again, because of the restrictions, we're not going to be able to host that in the traditional sense. It's a day often for reunions of medical and nursing fraternity, but that won't be happening. There will, however, be an online presentation, a series of pieces that make up the format for View Day, including a church service for Barts the Great. And it'll also include the official launch for Barts 900, the events leading up to Barts 900th anniversary in 2023. You can read all about this, of course, in our monthly emails that you get as a matter of course, including links to all the recordings on our YouTube channel of this and our other webinars. And finally, another event to look forward to, the next City Music Foundation free concert in the Great Hall is next month. And that will be a setting of Dvorak's cello concerto that has been specially transposed for a quintet. And I'm sure that's going to be fantastic, fantastic value. So before we sign off, David, a final word from you after that excellent presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I just want everybody who's still listening to urge you, none of you, to try any of these things yourself. Don't go off down the byways and highways trying to dig up plants and try them, please. And don't go trying your dogs to any plants under the gallows tree and causing their death. So it's been a great pleasure to be here. Robert, thank you for looking after me so well, and I hope everyone enjoyed it all.
Well, thank you once again, David. That's excellent. I tell you what, I promised to put a disclaimer on the title slide of the recording when we put that up on YouTube, just to cover everybody involved. I think that's the way forward. So we're looking forward to brighter days ahead. There is a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, and I don't know about you, but I'm very much looking forward to getting a haircut before long. And so you'll see a rather different me, I hope, when we meet again next month. So until that happens, a very good evening. Goodbye.